a few years ago, I was at a funeral, and it was a funeral of a friend's grandma. And one of the things that struck me in her eulogy was how her granddaughter talked about how she would always turn the lights on. And I hope that in some way today that I'm able to turn a light on for you and just give you a little encouragement in some way, shape, or form. Just as a little point of background for you, I did it all. So did it all in that we tried everything in the education front. We homeschooled our kids when they were young. And then we basically went to almost every iteration of school that was available to us here in our town and in Grosse Pointe. And we sent our kids to the academy. We sent one to Liggett for middle school. We were in public school. We were, all the kids graduated from South. So we really did a bit of everything. And I hope that what you're able to take away today, no matter where you are in the spectrum, I know some of you have new babies, so you're just maybe thinking about what you might do one day educationally. And some of you are already have school going, and I want to just encourage you from my story that you really, hopefully some of the principles that I share today, you'll figure out how to apply to your life. I think that's true about any parenting book. You should just kind of see it as a bit of a buffet and figure out, okay, I'm going to take these things and I'm going to use them for myself. So hopefully you'll see that. And I'm going to give a little shout out to my daughter-in-law, Danny, as well, who has her kids in school. But I think that she actually is educating them at home in such a beautiful way. I see it in everything she does. And so I think that you can do a both and I hope that you hear some things from me in that regard. So before I begin, I want to ask you some questions to have you just kind of think about while I'm sharing, and then hopefully at the end you'll have questions for me. But Stephen Covey, who wrote 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, talked about beginning with the end in mind, and that when you begin with the end in mind, when you think about what you want to achieve, you are better able to see the outcome that you desire. So what I'd like to ask you today is to consider, why might I homeschool? Or what can I take away from today that I can apply in my own home? But on the outcome front, to think about, what do I want my kids to look like as full-grown adults? What kind of character qualities do I want my kids to possess? What kind of citizens do I want them to be? What kind of Christians do I want them to be? For me, the question was, what kind of men do I want them to be? Do I want them to be wimpy or courageous? I had a situation as a young single girl where I remember moving to Miami and knowing no one and going to a couple of singles group. And I was kind of struck by, I was like, okay, where are all these strong Christian men? And I remember talking to God about that. And the thing that he spoke to my heart at that time was, you're going to help me with this. And lo and behold, all I have is boys. So, that was something that I really thought a lot about as we were, as I was nursing my first child, and just thinking about what I wanted his character to look like when he grew up. One of the core values in our family was being other-centered. And so I really think that, just thinking about some of those character qualities that you want your child to possess. We wanted our kids to really have a generous heart in the way that they lived, that they would be men who would be willing to really lay down their life for others, and that they would be able to love their neighbor as themselves, that they would do it with their whole life, that their actions would really follow their faith. And so this was a really strong thing in the way that as young parents were thinking about what we wanted for our kids. I feel like in today's world, thinking about grounding your children, really helping them to be rooted and grounded in who they are is so important in this ever-changing world that we're living in. The idea that my children, I challenge you to think about, like, how might you help your children to really own their faith rather than just give it lip service. So let's go right to the first question. Why homeschool? Understanding why you do anything is really important, and it pretty much drives everything else. For me, one of the things that caused me to consider homeschooling was when Michael was a baby, our oldest son was a baby, we moved to Chicago, and my husband started working for a company where, from my perspective, everyone homeschooled. All the families homeschooled. It was a rather large company, north of 200 people, and every single family I met was homeschooling their children. And the thing that Tony and I noticed about these families was that there was a qualitative difference in the way that children interacted with one another. We saw this kind of kindness, a nurturing attitude from one child to another. I want to call it kind of a one for all and all for one sort of thing that seemed to be in every family we met. It was like, wow, there's really something different about these families. And so it gave us pause. It really made us think. Tony and I both grew up in being schooled in more traditional fashion. And so, we kind of leaned in at this stage of the game. And I had the privilege of spending time with his boss's wife, who had 10 children and was a big proponent of homeschooling. And the funny thing about her and me at that time was her 10th child was born in the same month as my first child. So we're sitting there nursing our babies together, and I'm as old as her oldest child. And I had this funny sense of like, is it okay if I'm friends with her? Like, she's so much older than me. She's my husband's boss's wife, And but I really liked her, and she had so much wisdom to share with me. And we just ended up spending a lot of time together. And a lot of what I'm going to share today, I really want to give Sharon Ritchie credit for. She just really poured into me and helped, I want to say, give me the courage to try homeschooling. And so just to even give you a picture of that qualitative difference of homeschool families, we were at her husband's funeral just a short time ago, and her daughter has 10 children, and they were sitting in the front row, and it was just so precious to see one of the older boys walk in with the youngest child on his hip. And over the course of the service, the child got lovingly cared for by each of the children and just kind of passed down the line. And I thought, oh my gosh, like, you guys, I told Jenny afterwards, you make me want my kids to homeschool because your family just has just such a beautiful way about them. So anyway, we were intrigued, and we really started to think about, what is going to help our children become the men that we want them to be. What is the best way to go about this? Well, at the time we were living in Chicago, and there was it was like Martha and the nannies at the park. I mean, it was, most of the people I knew were working moms. There was nothing like this in my church. I had to start something like this to even have any kind of fellowship with other young moms. And so we lived downtown, and then the Richies lived out in the country. And so I was kind of living in two worlds that way. But I had a lot of friends who were sending their kids to I had a number of friends who were sending their kids to preschool at 2 years old. And I remember thinking, I'm just not ready for that. And then I'd go out and I'd spend time with these homeschooling families, and I'd think, there's really something kind of intriguing about that. And then we ended up moving out to Big Rock, which is a very rural area, just an hour from Chicago. And I was spending more time with these families. And I remember when I moved in, Sharon came over. Again, she's my boss's wife. She has 10 children. She's homeschooling. And she came over and she looked at the house that I was moving into, which happened to be the parsonage of the Big Rock Baptist Church. And she just kind of turned up her nose, and she was like, we got to clean. And she just, rolled up her sleeves and got down on her hands and knees, and she scrubbed my floors. And then her mom, who was at this point in her mid-70s, I believe, maybe pushing 80, she came over, she helped me clean. But it was just this kind of life on life thing that I was experiencing. And I was also watching her children do this. And so it was kind of a beautiful picture of some of what I'll be sharing on kind of the philosophy behind homeschooling that was prevalent at the time. So one of the things that Sharon taught me was from a guy named Raymond Moore, who was kind of the voice of homeschooling at that time. Nowadays, you can buy, you can watch podcasts and have all this. Back then, there were just a few kind of experts in the field. But Raymond Moore was a very interesting man because he had this academic career in education and then became this strong voice in the homeschooling world. And his philosophy about homeschooling was really that it was better to wait to send your kids to school, period. And the philosophy was basically better late than early, that it was really advantageous to your children to keep them home and give them time to develop their self-identity and to help them to really understand how loved and known they are, that a child in those early years in a warm, nurturing environment just has a better time developing that sense of who they are, and that would help them in life and really help them to be the kind of adult that is a self-starter, is responsible, is one who gives back to others, and that in his philosophy of education or home education, it was really light on the education piece, that the act of really building character into your children and making that a priority of your education was more important than the academics, because he had all kinds of research about how you could put, there was a point in history where they did not teach math until kids were 10 years old. And what they found was that kids that started math later caught up to the kids who had started math in kindergarten, and they, within like 3 months, by Christmas time, they were almost caught up with the kids who had started math early. But when the interesting thing was, by the time those same kids were tracked, went to high school, 1% of the kids who had started math early were taking all the math classes you could possibly take in high school. But the kids who started math late, a huge percentage, like 50%, were taking all the classes, math classes in high school. And by the time they went to college, still only 1% of the kids who started math early were interested in pursuing it at the college level. But the kids who started late, a large percentage were interested in pursuing it at the college level. So what that showed was, if you want to teach kids to love math, start them later. Yeah. And so he had lots of research, in this regard, but also a lot of research around just that idea of identity development. And he would talk about how when you put kids in kindergarten, you're effectively teaching them, they teach themselves to be peer dependent, because you can't help but compare yourself to others. And but if you wait, the child is much more likely to be an independent thinker, and much more likely to have strong attachment to their parents, and so therefore want to emulate their parents' values, and they have an extremely, I want to say, a more well-developed, loving relationship with their parents, because from a child's perspective, love is always equated with time spent. So these were things that really, that Sharon was sharing with me, that really shaped my thinking and sort of helped me say, well, maybe I could give this a go. And then when, during that period of time, because we had moved out to the country, there really weren't any preschools that I would want to send my child to. And so I just kind of continued along this path, not adopting the idea that I'm a homeschooler, but more by default, not putting my child in school. And then we moved to Grosse Pointe. And Grosse Pointe was known for its schools, and everybody, one of the first questions people would ask me was, where are you going to send your kids to school? And I had really felt during those 5 years of, raising the boys, and by this time I had 3 children, that if I was going to do it, kindergarten was the time, because it was like, okay, if I fail, it'll be all right, right? And because nobody's taken their kindergarten grades to college with them. And but that really helped me to have the courage, was just that sense of, I'm just going to try it, and I'm going to see what happens. And so I made it my goal to just teach Michael to read. I kind of took the things that I'd learned from Sharon and from Raymond Moore, and I felt really comfortable with just giving it a go that way. And interestingly, along those lines of reading, it's important for you to know that I came from a family where two of my siblings, in our family story, were known as slow learners because they read later, and they did not learn to read until right around the 3rd grade level. And I remembered that being kind of like not a great thing in our family, that they were constantly reminded, even when they were at the college level, oh, Tom was a slow learner. Tom was actually held back in 2nd grade. And, Kathy, both my siblings that were slow learners went on to get graduate degrees. Somehow they managed. But it was really comforting to learn from Raymond Moore just these issues about like brain development, and that some kids really aren't ready to learn to read. Their little brain has not kind of connected all the parts that help them to learn to read. And so one of the nice advantages of homeschooling is the child doesn't know they're a slow learner. They're just kind of going along, and they're loved and accepted in their own environment, and they feel no kind of shame associated with learning to read later. Well, my sister had a daughter who was my son Wesley's age, and her kids were in school, and Harper was struggling with reading as well. She was not able to learn to read, and the teacher was putting a fair amount of pressure on my sister about this. And I remember just being able to encourage her and say, you know what, Beth, just do not take any of that into your spirit. Just really try and shield her from any sense that she's not kind of up to snuff. Don't tell her she's a slow learner. And I can tell just from interacting with her that she'll get it. And sure enough, Harper, as a third grader, went into third grade not being able to read. And by the end of third grade, she was reading Harry Potter. It just, the pieces hadn't come together for her in the, at the beginning. And it's just so important that no matter what you choose to do, that if you have that sense of, kids do progress at different levels. There's no kind of, all the research shows, and it's one of the challenges of traditional schooling, is that you've got kids at different levels. So you're trying to keep the ones who are really, far ahead, challenged, and you're trying to help the ones who are kind of falling behind to get up to speed. But kids learn at different levels at different times. And so that was one of the things that, as I looked at homeschooling, I thought, that would be advantageous if I give this a go and kind of see how if I'm able to do it, that, if they are a little slow, kind of coming to the reading table, then they'll never know it. And I know that can help them in life, because once they get it, they'll get it. So what Raymond Moore showed was he looked at the Smithsonian Institute did a study on geniuses, and what they found were a number of characteristics of the education of geniuses. And then he basically looked at what makes a good homeschool environment. And there was total alignment with all of these things. So the first thing that he found was that that the child spends more time with adults than other children. So clearly, homeschool has an advantage in that category, because the ratio of even the largest family that I ever met that was homeschooling was 10 children. It's a 1-to-10 ratio, which if you are looking at schools, that would be a very selective, expensive private school, maybe. But you probably would have more like 15 kids in the classroom. And then in a public school, you might have 25 be the norm, and then if they were really overcrowded, you might have 32. So 1-to-32 ratio versus a 1-to-1. And so clearly homeschool was something that, wow, that's interesting. And the adult does not have to be the parent. So Margaret Mead, who was a well-known writer and anthropologist from the 20th century, her mom schooled her by just finding interesting people for her to spend time with. And she recounts spending time with a beekeeper, a candle maker, and someone who taught her to pick blueberries. So we're not talking about academics, but these people were passionate about what they did, and so they inspired her, Margaret, to be the woman that she ended up being. And especially if you have a large family, engaging relatives or tutors can be a great way to have that work for you. We actually did a hybrid homeschool situation, and as more of the boys were in grade school ages, we ended up hiring a teacher, doing that with another family where we shared the teacher, and she was just teaching the older children, and I was teaching the younger children how to read, so that can work out really well, and so it's an interesting thing to think about. So the first thing is just that the child spends more time with adults than they do with other children. The second thing that they found in building geniuses and having a good homeschool was that teachers in the child's life are not authoritarian, but they're congenial companions who help them learn. So really a loving, nurturing teacher is the best way to help a child learn. And clearly, again, homeschool kind of wins in this one because nobody's going to love your kids as much as you do. I mean, even the best teacher does not love your kids the way you do. So the third aspect is that the child chooses what to study. And this is the Montessori. And this is Maria Montessori, who was the founder of Montessori schools, but this was her whole thing, was that a child who wants to learn something is highly motivated, and all of the learning sticks because they're interested in that fact. The fourth thing that Moore discovered was that having the same instructor for more than 3 years was really beneficial for helping a child maximize their learning potential. And that makes total sense because you know where the child's gaps are, you know where they need to grow and be challenged, but you also know kind of where their struggles are, and you've just seen them over time. So it can be so helpful to really help your child have the best situation of learning is to have the same teacher over time. And then the idea of developing a strong work ethic. And this is important to realize that this is entirely out of academics. So academics is something that's very much, me-centered, but work ethic is kind of has to do with others. So whatever you can do in your home to help your children develop a strong work ethic, early chores, little routines that, in the beginning, they may seem almost silly. I mean, I thought it was the cutest thing. I was visiting my son and daughter-in-law a month ago, and they have Charlie sweep the stairs. And she said, I have her sweep the stairs. They live in a two-flat because I don't care how clean they come out. Because sometimes it's hard to delegate things because the children can't do it as well as you want it done. And when you start delegating jobs to your kids, you do kind of need to be okay with it not being as well as you can do. And but over time, they get better. And so little by little, you can really build their ability to be contributing members of the family. But another thing that helps build work ethic is involvement in sports. And the other day I was at Cece's game at Eagle Sports, and I just thought, when I was at this game, I was just blown away because it was raining so hard, and I was just like, oh my gosh, this is 4-year-old soccer. Like, I can't believe we're out here. But I sat there and I thought about what a great thing it is that these kids are not being deterred by the rain, and they're actually building fortitude by being out in the rain. And there were so many beautiful benefits of this time out there. I thought it was the cutest thing. Little Cohen, Gray, looked up at me and gave me the biggest grin. And it was just like, oh my gosh, like back to community, back to what y'all are doing here. But he felt loved because I was there, cheering him on. And I thought, that is so sweet. And what a good little thing for his little self-image it is, that he knows me and he knows I love him, and that when I'm cheering for him too. And all that to say, there's so many things that you can do with your kids that actually build so much more than just soccer, just the kicking the ball skills. There's so many benefits that a sports experience can provide. So as we started, I think I mentioned, we just kind of gave it a go. And I remember having, so I had all this in my backdrop, and as I interpreted what I just shared with you, I interpreted it as almost like Raymond Moore is recommending that I don't really do much academic work with my children. And there was a lot of, he even had things like, a kindergartner should only spend about 15 minutes doing anything academic. And you want to read to your kids at least an hour a day. But, that could be split up over time, and it shouldn't feel heavy pressure. It should be fun and, a joyful thing. And you really need to watch and see how the child is responding to what you're learning. So as I was interpreting this, I'm like, okay, he's basically recommending that I don't really even have a formal curriculum. And for me, I am kind of achievement oriented, and I needed to sort of prove myself in this area, and I needed to know that I can do this, and I needed to have some proof that I was doing it well, just for my own kind of, otherwise I'll feel like I failed my children, was my own interpretation of this. So anyway, I made it my goal that first year to teach Michael to read. And what I found was the first 3 months, it just felt like he was a little out to lunch and not really connecting with anything. And it felt kind of a little on the useless and a little frustrating. Really tried to keep it fun, not have it be too heavy. But I found that he, by January, actually was starting to engage with it. And by March, he had learned to read. And that played out in each of my kids, that it took a little while to kind of prime the pump. And then the actual learning to read piece took about 3 months once they were ready. And then once they learned to read, it was amazing, because then they could actually do so much of what I wanted them to do. They were much better at following through on everything, because it was like, okay, we had that watershed thing figured out, and then they could do a lot of their own work. And so that, I think, is just kind of a helpful thing. And I really put math to the side because of a lot of what I'd learned from Raymond Moore. I felt like, okay, we're just going to make math fun. I had a formal curriculum that took us through the Bible. We had a language arts where there were some beautiful, it was very literature-based. I can't stress enough that if you're at all considering homeschooling, really feed your kids the best literature you possibly can, the most beautifully illustrated children's books, all available at the library. Whether you homeschool or not, I do think that it's advantageous for believers to be as best educated and have really sound minds. But beauty is something that speaks to kids even before they can handle numbers. So in those early years when I wasn't formally homeschooling, and we lived in Chicago, I would take my kids to the museums. And we'd go all the time because it was just how we handled the cold winter months. And one of my favorite places to go was the Art Institute. So similar to taking your kids to the DIA, we'd just walk through and it was amazing to me how much my boys, remember they're boys and they're all boy, could really appreciate beauty and these beautiful works of art. And I remember getting this game that was the game of concentration, which if you remember, you're basically just trying to have two pairs of things. You can do it with a normal deck of cards and you're just trying to have two twos, and then you get a pair and the person at the end with the most pairs wins. And Michael, right away, like within 2 times of playing the game, could flip over a card and he could say the artist, the name of the painting, and be able to find the other painting. And he would beat me hands down. But what amazed me was his little mind's capacity to absorb this thing. And the reason that kids can really absorb beauty when they can't yet read is because it's so unique and we're drawn to beauty. God made beauty and beauty gives glory to God. And so, if that's why beautifully illustrated books are important, because they draw a child into the story. And as you're reading the story to the child, they're leaning in, they're listening, they're looking at the picture, and they're just fascinated by it. And they're more fascinated by it the better the artist is. So what are some of the obstacles to homeschooling? It's too much work. It just takes too much time. That's an interesting thing to sort of hold out there and think about, because in the U.S., the most time any public school will give a child who can't be in the classroom, so let's say your child is in an accident, can't go to school, the school will provide 1 hour a day for the child. So that's kind of an interesting comparison to the 9 to 3 model. But if they're at home or in the hospital, they'll give them 1 hour a day. And it's important to understand that once you are in the homeschooling, you're actively homeschooling your child and they can read, they are able to do so much on their own. You instruct them for a bit of time and then they put it into practice. And so this idea that it takes too much time, what I noticed that once I put my kids in school, I actually was doing the same amount of instruction, helping them do their homework. Except when I was homeschooling them, we were doing it in the mornings when we were all fresh. I'm a morning person. I liked it better. And when my kids were in school, I was doing it when I was tired. And they were their love cups were kind of empty, and they were less. It felt more work doing the homework thing at the end of the day than it did when we were homeschooling. Another obstacle would be I can't be home with my child. I have a job outside the home, which I know is very fair, and a lot of people have that. And it's something that I would encourage you that if God is calling you to homeschool, and I firmly believe that it's a calling. It's not for everybody, but it's a calling. But it's important to ask God, okay, yes, but how? Like, if you're calling me to do this, how am I supposed to make it happen? And with parents working from home and, even people staggering work hours, there are definitely ways that you can make it happen. And even the idea of a caretaker helping in the education process is something to consider. The idea that, okay, my kids are already in school, he'll miss his friends, he'll resent me for taking them out. I definitely know and understand that as somebody who put my kids in school, and then I took my son Caleb, my third son, back out again and homeschooled him after he'd been in school for a couple of years. So I know that can be kind of an awkward transition. But as long as the child has buy-in and they are kind of excited about this new adventure, it'll work out. There's always an adjustment. My experience in homeschooling my kids was that every year at the beginning of the year, after the summer months of just play, there was always a transition of developing the habit of, okay, now we're having homeschool. But once we sort of developed our little routine, that routines are your friend no matter what you decide as a mom. They are really helpful in just kind of ordering your home. But in the homeschooling world, it's huge just to have a nice little routine that you do, that the kids know what to expect. And once they develop the habit, it takes about 40 days to develop any habit. And they'll just be in that groove and they'll know what to expect. One of the things I did with my kids to help my homeschooling process was I got them little uniforms. So my kids would have to put on their little khaki pants and their little collared shirt and come down to school. And, I noticed that when they played sports, they were really into the uniforms. So I'm like, okay, we're going to have uniforms for school too. And so that was kind of a fun way that we got into school mode. Another obstacle might be I'm not a professional, I'm not skilled to teach. And if I can't teach, my child won't learn. And clearly, this plagues everyone who homeschools, because you know what? We all have insecurities about our own ability. And, parenthood is one of the few things in life that you come into with basically no experience. And the only people who really have experience are people from huge families, and they're the oldest child. But the rest of us, we just kind of get thrown into it without, okay, go at it. And homeschooling can be a little bit like that you can feel that sense. I struggled a lot with the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, that clearly the kids who are going to these wonderful schools are getting a better education than I'm giving them at home. But I would encourage you that if you all are wanting to give it a try, that it will benefit your child in so many ways. It is well worth the effort. And it's interesting to note that in the 1800s, children began their formal schooling at about 8 years old. And by the time a student was 14 or 15, if they were the really bright child in their one-room classroom, they were assigned to be the teacher. And they would often, so teachers with kids, 15 or 16-year-old kids with no training, were teaching the young children. And so if it could happen back then to people with no training, it can happen with you. And so I would encourage you to give it a go, even if you feel like, oh no, I'm scared and I don't feel like I have the skills, because certainly you can talk to me about that, because I felt the exact same way. Maybe you feel like the materials are too expensive and public school is free. So, how can I make that trade-off? And I agree that materials are expensive, but where there's a will, there's a way. And for sure, I think good curriculums are worth the money. But when you're just starting out, you might want to just kind of learn from, maybe take some hand-me-downs from somebody else, what worked for you, use their curriculum. A used curriculum works just fine and costs less money. And, there's ways that you can do it. And also the comment that public school is free, my experience was it was actually quite costly. I remember going to Staples every year and spending a boatload of money on just the basics of, getting my kids in school. So there are costs in both camps. And when I kind of totaled up the total expense of sending the savings were remarkable because of things like, we certainly weren't worried about what we were wearing to homeschooling, aside from the fact that I did do this little uniform thing. But even that, they could wear the same 2 pairs of khaki pants and 2 shirts all week long because they only wore them for like an hour. And so anyway, another objective might be that when children drop out of the public system, other children in the community are deprived from their good influence. And that is a very valid concern, just because clearly we are called to be salt and light in our community. And so as somebody who chose to homeschool, we really made a strategic decision about ways that we could be a positive light in our community. We did different things like had a backyard Bible club, and my kids were on various sports teams where they developed relationships with other kids. And we did a lot of ministry in our community, holding neighborhood Bible studies, things like that, where my kids had a sense of really being imprinted on their souls that we are to be a light to our neighbors and to be a positive influence. Another obstacle that some people consider would be that when families isolate their children, they don't grow up functioning and being contributing members of society. And certainly that would be true. If you have the attitude of just like the world, is our enemy and we need to kind of just get in our little holy huddle over here and never spend any time with the outside world, that can happen. But I would challenge you that clearly Jesus tells us to go into all the world and make disciples. And so it's our responsibility, and we can have that positive influence through our children's friends, neighbors that come over that we can love on, and different things that we can do, whether we homeschool or not, to be a light in our community. Another obstacle would be, people often say kids don't have enough social interaction with their peers and they'll grow up weird and unhappy. And certainly some homeschoolers are weird. And, but, Sharon would always say, well, look at their parents. Their parents are a little weird. And so whether they went to school or not, they would be a little weird. And so that is, it's entirely possible that they might be more weird, but it's something to think about. I love, if you've never read the book, if you're at all thinking about homeschooling on the weird spectrum, there's a wonderful book that was on the bestseller list for quite some time called Educated. And it's the story of a woman who was homeschooled in, I think, Montana or Idaho. And her family owned a junkyard. And they very much followed Raymond Moore's advice of kind of unschooling. They taught their kids to read, but then they were just kind of free to play in the junkyard, and they worked in the junkyard. And the whole book is just this crazy roller coaster story of this very weird family. But it's fascinating because the author is a beautiful writer, and she ends up at Cambridge, England, getting her PhD, and so it's just kind of it's interesting to think about. But that might be a fun book to read for those who are thinking about it. And then the last objection would be that parents are not competent to teach as a professional. And again, I think that, that is something that it weighs on you, that when you embark on homeschooling, you feel a little ill-equipped if you are not an education major in college or don't have training in the education field. But if you talk to someone who got their degree in education, you might be surprised how much time the education process is actually classroom management rather than inspiring children. And so it's something to think about if we keep in mind that the main reason that you are doing it is because you feel called by God to really pour into your child for this season. That I loved the idea that Raymond Moore really pushed was it's not forever, but it's really, just get them to kind of 10, if you can. That if you can, the longer that you can keep them at home in a loving, nurturing environment, the more they'll know who they are, and the more they'll be able to stand against the tide of society. Your responsibility to really imprint their love for Jesus and help them grow and become disciples of Christ, it rests on your shoulders. And so, just love for God, love for learning, like He made us. God made us to want to learn. And your little kids, they want to learn, they want to please you. And the more that you can keep that in mind, even on the most frustrating day, it'll help you along the way, no matter what you decide to do.